Interrupt all the lively discussion, but we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. First item on the agenda would be requests for bill introductions. Do we have any requests? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Pat Proctor from Leavenworth. I'd like to request the introduction of RS 1614 on behalf of Tanya Theis and the Watkins Sea Ranch. The bill very simply adds trail riding to the list of activities that's covered by agritourism.
Okay. Committee, any questions? Any objection? Seeing none, the request is approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further requests for bill introductions? Seeing none, committee, I think we do have, you should have gotten an email from the committee assistant, Leah. We will have minutes to approve for February 25th. If you want to take a look at those, we will approve those tomorrow. First item of business for the day on hearings is House Bill 2318, and we'll go right into an overview from the revisers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2318 would provide for future income tax rate decreases based on a contingent on the state exceeding revenue. The bill would provide that for a possible decrease in income tax rates based on a formulaic calculation, whether the general revenue fund tax receipt collections would exceed a comparison of the prior fiscal year compared with a base year with calculated increases for inflation. On August 15th of each year, the director of the budget would determine if an excess exists of general fund collections when compared to the base year. In the event there would be, the amount of excess would be converted into a decrease in the income tax rates to go into effect for the next tax year. Individual income tax rates would first be decreased until both brackets were lowered to essentially one rate at 4.5%. Then once this income tax rates would reach 4.5, there'd be a reduction in the corporate, would decrease the surtax on corporations until the combined rate of both the normal and the surtax on corporations would also equal 4.5%. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Adam. Committee, any questions for the reviser? Yes, Representative Helgerson, welcome back.
It's nice to be back. Explain to me what happens if we have a court-ordered mandate, have additional funds, but we have to spend the funds in order to take care of school finance. Did I explain it clearly, or?
I mean that.
I'm looking at the.
I think what you're anticipating is, I mean, this bill would anticipate just any sort of revenue increases. That'd be a mathematical calculation. And so spending then would be just an alternative, wouldn't really have any impact on if the revenue would exceed the prior base year. This would happen regardless whether or not a court would order additional spending without additional legislative enactment.
So we get the additional spending that's required by the courts, and then we calculate if there's any leftover money.
I mean, this is tax receipts going into the state general fund, so it's not the general fund. So it's basically the tax collections, not the spending.
I'll hold the rest.
Representative Corbett, did you have a question? Okay. Committee, any further questions for the reviser? Seeing none, thank you, Adam. Committee, we don't have a fiscal note that is loaded onto the S drive. There is a fiscal note that's available. I didn't know if Kathleen, if you wanted to speak to it. It's kind of a null fiscal note, and maybe Eddie would be able to explain it better, but paper, rock, scissors. I might have Eddie just speak to it then.
So for the first year, the current revenue estimates do not forecast an increase in receipts, so there's no forecasted trigger of the rate reduction attributable to this, and so no impact is the first year. The future years would be an indefinite reduction in receipts based upon increases in receipts if that sounds counter backwards, but that's how it works. I think that's, unless Kathleen wants to chime in, I think that's the best summary of it.
Does anybody have any questions on the fiscal impact? Because it's essentially it's setting a base year or a base amount, and the proponents can probably get into this a little bit more in detail, but additional revenue above that is dedicated toward buying down the rate. So it's not really a fiscal cost to the state, even though it would be a fiscal impact in reducing that rate in future years. But we have no idea what that is until we know what tax receipts are. But seeing no further questions, we will, oh, Representative Long, my apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does this bill allow for receipts under the predictions to bring that back up then? If no, it's just.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, the tax rates would be held firm. Once lowered, they would hold consistent until further reduced.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Representative Butler, yes.
So I'm not sure who to address this to later, but is there going to be, it says when we have if there's more revenue coming in, then that will be judged on that. Is there going to be a certain percentage? So if our revenue exceeds expenditures by so much money, then it'll be dropped a certain percentage, a certain quarter. I know that's what Kentucky does. I have a friend there, and there's this untriggered based on the amount, and it drops. Is that the way this will be? Is it a percent?
Yeah, I might wait. We might hold those questions for the proponents. I think they might be able to answer that a little more concisely than I can attempt to do that. Okay. All right, now, seeing no further questions, we will move on to the proponents. And welcome first to committee, Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Eric Stafford, and I am the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Kansas Chamber. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today in support of House Bill 2318, which is modeled off of North Carolina and West Virginia and their growth triggers. So since 2020, more than half of the states have cut income taxes, placing Kansas is even further behind of our competitive stance from especially our neighboring states. So last year, as we were talking tax policy, our president and CEO did a little bit of research on where does Kansas actually stack up. You know, it's easy to say we're highest among our neighboring states. But then we looked at the neighboring states of our neighboring states, which totals about 16 states. And the only state that has a higher top income tax rate than us is New Mexico. Everybody else is lower. Colorado has a single rate of 4.4%. Iowa, a single rate of 3.8%. Now, they used to have a progressive tax structure like we did. They've been very aggressive on getting to a single rate. Missouri is graduated. Their top rate is 4.7%. Nebraska's top rate is 5.2 for a few examples. And so when we started researching, how do we do this? The big push last year, the last 2 years, was getting Kansas to a single rate for taxpayers, for competitiveness, to get our rate low enough to be in the top half of states. But, last year, the last 2 years, we had a hard time getting a bill across the finish line. And we all know the reasons why. We don't need to go into those. But ultimately, what you guys did pass through the special session last summer put the structure in place to get us there. Part of the concern was getting to a single rate would lead to potentially a tax increase on low-income earners who are paying the 3%. But critics would say that, these are tax cuts for the wealthy going to 3%. But if you look at our tax code, you're getting into the second rate in Kansas, what used to be our second rate of 5.2 when you earn $30,000 married filing jointly. I don't think that qualifies under anybody's definition of wealthy here in the state. You would also get into our top rate at $60,000. So, The chart on page 2 of our testimony was from our economist that spoke to the House Commerce Committee earlier this session, and it lays out the competitiveness ranking both on the personal and individual income tax side of things from the Tax Foundation. And you can see we do have some neighboring states that are around where we are on the individual income tax side. We are a glaring outlier for our neighboring states on the corporate side. But we are in a race for talent. We are in a race for investment. And when individuals are considering job opportunities, not only are they going to look at the salary, but they're going to look at what does it cost to live or move to that state? What does it cost to buy a home? What does insurance cost? What does it cost to register a vehicle? But we have to be competitive. We have to be competitive for income tax purposes, both corporate and individual. We have to attract talent to get here. Our nation as a whole has a very low birth rate. So unless we want to start having a lot more kids, we will continuously have a workforce issue. And we have heard the word workforce in this building countless times over the last few years. But at the end of the day, it's about people. And the answer is that money walks. People will choose to go where is economically beneficial for them and where opportunities arise. Everybody in here knows Kansas is a great place to live. It's a great place to raise a family. It's a great place to spend time outdoors. Maybe not 2 weeks ago when it was 4 degrees, but summers are pretty glorious in Kansas. But as workers in this mobile workforce weigh job opportunities, they have to figure out what does it cost to live where we're considering moving to. But Kansas, on property income and sales, we are on the high end. We're top 10 in the nation on our state and local combined sales tax rate. We are on the bottom half of mediocre on the personal income tax side and the corporate income tax side. We are even the 12th highest in the nation on our cell phone taxes. So Kansas tax everything a lot, and we need to tax less that would result in further economic growth. So that said, that's why we started looking into what ultimately became House Bill 2318, that we believe to be a responsible and reasonable path toward improving our competitive standing as a state. North Carolina, West Virginia, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Arizona, Georgia, Missouri, Mississippi's now looking at it, Oklahoma's looking at it, Arkansas. They have all pushed towards moving towards a single rate, lowering taxes in the last 5 years. They've utilized the growth triggers in many of those instances. Arizona has been able to lower their income tax rate to 2.5%, which is the lowest rate in the nation. Just last month, the Oklahoma governor for his state of the state said that, you know, we need to be competitive against Missouri, we need to be competitive against Texas, we need to be competitive against Arkansas. He did not mention Kansas, and he's calling for a 0.5% reduction of their state's income tax from 4.75 to 4.25. But he did not mention Kansas because we're just not one of the states that they have to compete with right now, just like KU doesn't have to compete with K-State in football. I mean, or they don't. Same can be said in basketball, but, you know, it's fine. I bleed purple. So a lot of questions early to the reviser. How does this growth trigger work? It's basically the opposite of how we've always done things, how we've always looked to cut taxes. And we did it last June, we did it last March, we did it last April. What does this cost the state if we lower the rate to X? And then how do we figure out the budget after the fact? This goes in the opposite direction. This says we're going to create the baseline revenue. So that number in the bill, which is, let me get to it. Sorry, I was piddling around here. I knew I would screw this up. Okay, $10,003,833,599. That's your baseline revenue number as of tax receipts before last June's tax cuts went into effect. You have that baseline revenue number. The state is allowed to capture receipts that go up and above, up to inflation. So say inflation's 2%, but we grow receipts by 3.8%. That 1.8% difference must be used to lower income taxes, and that's calculated by the Department of Revenue. So that's how North Carolina did this. North Carolina, back in 2012, had a top rate of 7.7%. They were the 48th best state in the nation for their tax climate, according to the Tax Foundation. After they implemented this growth trigger, they became the #1 state in the nation for business, and they are one of the fastest growing states in the country. They now have a single rate of 4.25%. Their corporate rate's down to 2.5%, but it's scheduled to get phased out as well through this growth trigger. It's still into effect. And to Representative Long's question, if receipts do not hit that benchmark, and that benchmark always moves, so you will always increase that number with the inflationary amount. Say 2 years from now we have a recession, we bump that number up twice because we're currently under that number right now. I think we're 9.6, 9.7 billion. So we start getting some rounds of income tax cuts, and then we hit a recession. Receipts plummet to 7 billion. Nothing happens until you reach that benchmark again, plus inflation, plus excess growth. So it protects you guys from having to be in a position where we put, you know, we're going to go from 5.58 and 5.2, we're going to cut 5.58 down to 5.4, and then we're going to cut it to 5.2 6 years from now, and then we're at a single rate of 5.2, and then we're going to have statutory reductions based on tax years, not based on economic reality of where we actually stand as a state. So you're protected during those periods because the revenues will be dipped below what that baseline number constantly adjusts to. We have this scheduled to be 4.5%. We were asked at lunch today, how'd you come up with 4.5%? Should it be lower? Honestly, we just looked at what do we view would get us into a competitive position, put us in the top half of states where most states fall, and 4.5% is a good, sound, competitive number. Once we reach that single rate on the income tax side for personal taxpayers, it would then kick over for corporate income taxes until we reach 4.5% on the corporate side. So as we were looking into this, we wanted some more perspective nationally, like how has this actually worked in other states, and had some conversations. I think there's some gentlemen that are going to be here today speaking in support of this bill from Americans for Tax Reform. Where he's like, hypothetically, like if we put this trigger in place back in 2014, where would we be on our income tax rates? And they said, well, you've actually, with growth, inflationary growth, you would have collected more taxes than you collect on personal income taxes. So theoretically, you could have gone to zero if you wanted to do it that way. We're not asking to do it that way. We're asking to stop at 4.5% because, again, that would put us in a very competitive position. So page 1 of our testimony, you'll see a little box on there that's a chart dating back to, I believe, 2012 that shows our receipts and expenditures. That is from the governor's budget report. That is not a Kansas Chamber created chart. That is historical spending and tax receipts, and you've seen that we've gone from about $6 billion worth of tax revenues to and spending to now over $10 billion. Again, the June special session lowered that by about $450 million, so we're now in the 9.6, 9.7 billion dollar range. So again, this is an entirely new way to cut taxes, but it's a proven way that's been effective in the states that have utilized it. It helps control spending, but also allows for that excess growth of revenues to be used to make our state more competitive. Somebody asked me, following up from conversation earlier, all right, so you mentioned North Carolina, so they went from 7.7 to 4.25 now as a single rate. Like, where's their budget stand? So I was like, I don't know, let me do a quick Google search. So I pulled it up, North Carolina budget status. They showed a $1.4 billion surplus for 24-25. Tax receipts came in about $400 million less in April, and so they actually had $1 billion surplus. So not only have they significantly cut taxes, significantly cut corporate income taxes, they have grown significantly. It is a high growth state. It has worked well and has helped attract investment for their state. And I guess I would just close by asking, you know, we are asking you to be visionaries. What do we want our state to look like? But we have to get off the stable of mediocrity and get to a position where we can be competitive. We believe that House Bill 2318 is the best way to do that. It's a proven way to do that. And there are other ways that you can add on to this structure that we would have in place today under 2318. Our Tax Foundation report goes through and highlights various sales tax exemptions and income tax credits that you guys could look at to broaden the base and lower rates, whether you wanted to use that revenue for sales tax, whether you wanted to use it for income tax. There are multiple ways to go about it. But if you put this in place that puts the spending limits on, but also allows for future income tax reductions, you could get there faster by taking what the tax foundation suggests and looking at those as well. That's not a March discussion. I know that's not a March discussion. That's a August, September, October, November, December discussion through an interim process. But philosophically, broadening the base and lowering rates is a good way to get there. So we would ask that you guys would support this. We want to grow our state. We have to be competitive, though, in order to grow our state. We can't just hope people choose to move to Kansas. They have to have a reason to come here, businesses and individuals. So we believe that this is a proven plan and would be an effective way to get us to a single rate and get us to a competitive position. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Stafford. I think we've got several proponents. We'll take questions at the end, committee. So if you have anything, jot it down and we'll come back to it. Our next conferee would be Tanner Temple with Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. We appreciate this opportunity to submit testimony in support of HB 2318. Again, my name is Tanner Temple. I'm the director, or deputy state director for Americans for Prosperity of Kansas. Going over this bill establishes a way to reduce Kansas income tax rates based on revenue performance, with reductions continuing until rates reach a specified minimum. A few things about the bill. HB 2318, it provides a sustainable path to tax relief. One key advantage of this is it's a commitment to fiscal responsibility by tying income tax reductions to actual revenue growth exceeding inflation-adjusted levels. Another point, looking at the lower income tax rates strengthen the economic growth of our state, so Kansas can remain competitive by ensuring tax relief is a structure to encourage business expansion and labor force participation. This bill also supports a long-term budget planning. So Kansas has experienced periods of volatile revenue collections due to unpredictable circumstances. This bill would prevent revenue shortfalls, ensuring that reductions are data-driven and in line with actual economic performance. This bill gives transparency to the taxpayer in the state. As the director of the budget will assess whether that just the general revenue fund collections surpass the inflation-adjusted base year revenues. If an excess is identified, the director will certify the amount to the Secretary of Revenue. This ensures that any tax rate reductions are based on actual financial performance, promoting fiscal responsibility. Upon the certification of excess revenue, the Secretary of Revenue will calculate and announce the corresponding income tax rate reduction. In conclusion, House Bill number 2318 represents a forward-thinking approach to taxation that aligns with economic goals of Kansas. It provides a clear, transparent, and equitable method for reducing income tax rates based on actual revenue performance. We believe that this legislation will enhance Kansas's competitiveness, attract new businesses, and ultimately lead to a more prosperous future for all Kansans. We urge the committee to support this bill and help us build a stronger, more resilient economy. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Next up, we have Alex Orrell with Kansas Bankers Association.
Good afternoon, committee. Alex Orrell, Senior Vice President, Government Relations for the Kansas Bankers Association. Honored to be before you today again. I think the previous conferees did a great job outlining the specific details of this proposal. So I'm going to focus my testimony on a proposed amendment that we would actually request. And it's a conversation that you have all heard me before this committee many, many times. Kansas banks are not subject to the Kansas corporate income tax. We are subject to our own income tax. It's called the Kansas privilege tax. And the difference in taxation is because we are taxed on the interest income that from U.S. Treasury agency and securities where other corporate incomes are not. So that's why there's the difference in taxation and the difference of rates. I highlight this issue and that the privilege tax is not a part of this current proposal, and it's not because of opposition. I'll be frank and honest. don't know the best way to draft it since the privilege tax is a different rate and it's two-tiered and banks are treated one way, trust and savings and loans are treated another way. So on my testimony, you'll actually see a chart showing privilege tax rates versus the corporate income tax, showing the corresponding rate reductions based on corporate income. So for instance, corporate income is reduced from 6.5% to 6.4%. That's a 1.54% reduction total. You just apply that same to the total bank rate and reduce it accordingly. You have a normal rate for banks, which is the first $25,000 of income, and then there's the surtax for anything over that amount, which creates that total rate. In the previous tax proposals over last year, we adjusted the normal rate, which is the first $25,000 of income. So in shaded would be those new normal tax rates. That is the corresponding rate reduction to the Kansas privilege tax compared to the corporate income tax. For Adam, or Mr. Sievers, I'd be curious how you put this in statute. Can you put a chart in statute? And we actually do have charts and sliding scales for unemployment insurance and other types of issues where you have put a chart. Because for the privilege tax, it would kind of be very interesting how you draft the exact verbiage of that. And talking to Ranking Minority Sawyer about it last week, it'd probably be 50, 60, 70, maybe 80 pages because it's 200 different changes in the statute based on what the corporate income. So that's why I provided the condensed chart of the testimony and frankly asking for help as well from the revisers on how best to draft that if this committee does seek to move forward with this proposal. We do think common sense tax reform makes sense. As the industry that does finance 99% of the business industry in Kansas, anything we can do to attract and retain our businesses is good. And we've made some headway over the last couple of years, and I appreciate the previous proponents and all the work that they have done, and we still got work to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your testimony. Our final conferee would be Dennis Hull with Americans for Tax Reform. And committee, if you're looking at your S drive, his testimony is out of order. We got it in late, so it's at the bottom. It's a little bit out of order, but you should have that on your S drive. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Dennis Hull. I'm State Affairs Manager with Americans for Tax Reform. It's a pleasure to be with you today and express enthusiastic support for HB 2318. I'd first like to congratulate you on the cut to 5.58 that you and your peers enacted last year. Dollars are already beginning to flow out of the unproductive public sector and back into the hands of entrepreneurs, families, and small businesses who file under the personal side of the tax code. By passing 2318, you're sending a signal to any person or business in the country that's seeking a new place to settle down that Kansas is a place that puts them and their pocketbooks first. All those people can be confident in this legislation's promise that year after year, the state will continue to restrain its growth, and in return, their tax burden will continue to ratchet down dollar by dollar. If I leave you with one thing today, let it be the fact that you would not be alone in enacting such policy. In fact, the rest of the country is pulling ahead of you significantly on competitive tax policy. Over the last decade, we've seen at least 8 separate states enact some form of trigger language. Some, like Kentucky and West Virginia, will eventually trigger all the way to 0. Others have already been triggering for years. The prime example here, as other proponents have mentioned, is North Carolina, which started in the high 7s for both personal and corporate. And thanks to the slow, steady, consistent, and responsible progress of the revenue triggers they enacted in 2013, they're now in the mid-4s, on the way to 2.49, and are ranked the #1 state for business in the country. And that's no accident. Other states that have already enacted some form of triggers include Georgia, Indiana, Louisiana, which actually used last year's special session to cut from a 4.4 progressive tax structure down to a 3% flat rate where they are today, and leadership is looking to ultimately go all the way to 0 in future years. You could also look next door to Missouri, where Governor Kehoe and leadership are set to pass trigger legislation of their own, all the way to 0. And across the country, we see, or we're expecting to see, some form of income tax cut enacted in at least 10 different states. This is historic progress, and ATR is elated to see Kansas once again consider meaningful income tax relief and the meaningful spending restraint that will, at the end of the day, make these tax cuts possible. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony, and that's all the conferees I have for proponents. Is there anyone else wishing to speak as a proponent to 2318? If not, committee, we will now open it up for questions. First, Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question can be for anybody. How does this proposal help us cut our constituents' property taxes? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber. This deals with income tax, Representative.
You know, earlier when we were talking to the revisor, we had some other questions. Do you want to reiterate those questions, Representative Helgerson? Yeah.
You know, how many years were we been talking about this? It's great to see it, I'll tell you. But I do have a couple of questions for you. Governor's office throughout the last 6 months or a year has been sending out these press releases about how great of an economic situation we have in Kansas. Are they wrong?
No, I don't think they're wrong if you're lucky enough to get an incentive to invest here, right? And so incentives are necessary. Even states that don't have income taxes have incentives. Texas has 6 or 7 of them, even as a state that has 0 income tax. So you're not wrong, but the ability to solely live on incentives doesn't last forever. But we've also seen HPIP grow to the point where there's about $1 billion, a little over $1 billion on the books for liability to the state for that investment that's been made. Part of the problem with that, and some of the information we were trying to get this past summer that I just don't think the data's collected to be able to get the answer. Businesses claim those credits when they have tax liability, or they can sell the tax credit for 50% of the value. Half of those credits, from the tax professionals we work with, half of those credits of the $1 billion that are on the books that impact your ability to budget will never be claimed. So if we have $500 million sitting out there that's not going to be claimed, but it's a liability to you guys, and I'm not advocating, trust me, we have a legislative agenda position to protect HPIP and PEAK. They are important incentive programs. But how can you capture that money that's never going to be touched, but it's a financial liability to you to be able to lower rates in the state? So overall, to your question, Representative, we still have to have a good climate for the businesses that are here to help them expand and to attract new businesses, because right now, if we're going to have high property taxes, to Representative Shu's question, if we're going to have higher income taxes, and if we're going to have high sales tax, it could potentially be unappealing unless you have a short-term tax relief program like HPIP, PEAK, or local property tax abatement that might be given for economic development program.
Can I? It's not, I agree with what you're saying. I'm just looking at we're going to hear, both in committee and on the floor, that we have a great sound economic program right now. So why do we need to change it? I'm asking, and you don't have to give any more now, but are there good economic analysis out there that says we may have done some good things, but we can do a lot better? But what you hinted at also was how the representative's question, how we give targeted tax relief at the local level, and that doesn't help property taxes. We give a lot of individuals, a lot of developers, targeted tax relief, and that doesn't help anybody at the local level. But let me go on to the other question I had. You and I have had this discussion for years. I hate to think how many years. My argument has always been that if you have 63 and 21, you could make these, and 1, 63, 21, and 1. You could always make these decisions. Well, heck, it's gone so far, you know, what is it? 89 plus 1, is that the joke? Francis? Francis, what is it? 89 plus 1, you could pay, isn't that the number you have over there now? 88? 88 plus 1. And you can do anything you want on passing the tax reductions. And you don't have to do it you don't have to have something long like this. You could automatically put it in the statute right now and do what you want this year. And the next year we could do another one. And the year after we could do another one. And the year after if that was the case. But the legislature continually balks at giving regular reductions in the income and the sales tax because they want to keep spending money. You want to comment on this? You and I have gone around about this for years.
We have. We have. What I would say is...
one more comment.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I've been sick, and so I have, I think, look, I'm not opposed to forcing their hand, the legislature's hand and the governor's hand, because that's the only way we got the 7.5% and forced the legislature down to saving some money over the years. We put it into statute and forced legislators to do what was fiscally responsible and financially best for the state. And maybe this is the way to do it. But there should be enough legislators that if they really feel this way, we should be able to do it right now. And we don't have to have a statute like this. Now you can go ahead and then we'll talk later on. Thank you very much for your patience.
It's a lot to take in, Representative. I think I've heard several impassioned speeches from you on the floor about the budget over the years. And I think that this would help with the budget in the sense that it does limit the ability up to inflation to increase spending, which I think if you look at it from a perspective of what we're wanting to do, it's allowing responsible spending increases, but also allowing for buy downs of rates. I mean, we could come with a bill every year that says, okay, we're going to lower it by another 0.02% or another 0.04% because receipts have been good. You could do it that way. I mean, I don't think any state's tried it that way. But the fact we've had multiple states do it this way and it is working, I think it's a good, reasonable, responsible way to look at ways to cut taxes instead of how do we figure out the budget after we lower rates, which is how we've always done it. And every state had always done it that way until this approach came around. And we just did it last year. We sit through tax conference and we hear what the fiscal impact's going to be. And then they adjust the budget accordingly. And then the budget's revised and the ending balance numbers are revised. But now this can change the way that you do things and allows the budget committee to not go crazy when years are good, which we've experienced, but it also rewards taxpayers through further reductions in the income tax rates.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for any of the proponents. So I agree with the concept that going to a single rate will, and certainly a lower single rate than what we've got now with the 2 rates, would attract businesses and would attract people to come to the state. Do we have any data whatsoever on to how many businesses we're talking about, how many people we're talking about? If we can get down to 4.5, this will attract?
No, I don't have any data on that. And maybe we could look at what some other states have done, what has happened to their GDP as they lower rates, get into a more competitive position. Something I was thinking earlier to Representative Helgerson's questions and comments that I can say here as well is look at where we've been. And that is stagnation in terms of population growth. We're very, very flat. and that has to change. And it only changes, again, that's where I was saying earlier, it deals with birth rates. That's where you have to look, you have to steal talent, you do. But you have to get business investment. And again, we so long focus on only bringing companies here. We have to focus on the businesses who are here to help them expand, giving them tax relief so they have more capital to expand. Because we did see that. Right or wrong, controversial, the tax cuts of 2012 focusing on small businesses were intended to give small businesses capital to expand, and there were success stories of businesses who did that. They expand, they hire more people. Do I have specific data for you? No. I can point you to North Carolina and you can see what their GDP has done, how much they've grown in the last 10, 12 years. But that's why states are doing this, is so they can be on the radar.
So let me ask the question in reverse. If we don't do something like this, are there any projections as to how much further behind we'll fall?
I think the answer to that question is continued stagnation that we've been experiencing.
I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that, but thank you, Eric. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions, committee? Representative Turner.
This question's for Alec. Oral. I'll ask as you're walking just to save some time. So as you presented your information, I wondered, are we just comparing to other testimony where they talked about how we are not competitive with surrounding states? How do we stack up in terms of the privilege tax with surrounding states? Because you didn't really bring that out in your testimony, and it just seems that you feel like you should proportionally get reduced as these others get reduced. Thank you.
Every state's different. So like, for instance, Kansas has the privilege tax. Many states have a bank franchise tax. So it depends on how each one of those states tax, like we do here in Kansas on the U.S. Treasury Agency and securities. I'd have to look at those other states, but in terms of the specific data, I think Missouri, I was looking at the other day, it's like 444. I think it's actually 444. But I'll get that data for you specifically. But it's hard to judge apples to oranges, frankly, I would say, depending on, because some states' banks are subject to the corporate tax too.
So your argument for reduction is basically just to be proportionally reduced as these others are reduced. I just wondered if there was a competitive aspect to it, and you're saying maybe, maybe not, because we don't really know.
Our privilege tax was set up under what our Kansas tax policy is. And so in terms of how corporate tax is treated comparably to ours, and that is when the legislature set the privilege tax rate at a different rate to recognize that difference in taxation here. So that's my understanding of just trying to be, as equal at banks or businesses too here. And if we're going to try and be competitive as possible, let's do it across the board. But I will actually follow up with you and the chairman. I'll get some more information.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is that historically where we came up with this base tax and surtax? I don't know, do other states have that? It just seems like a really interesting way to do things.
There's a very fantastic Kansas legislative research document from January 26, 2021 that goes into the history of the privilege tax and where it's fallen over the years. And I'm gladly send this around. It's a pretty extensive document, and I think the ranking minority, Sawyer, was here for some of these changes too. But I'll get back to the committee.
All right, committee, any further questions? Okay, we've got time for one more, and then we need to get proponent testimony, make sure we have plenty of time.
So I just want to go back to the question I asked earlier. Is there going to be, when we exceed the $10 billion, if that's the baseline, and we exceed that by a certain dollar value, is it going to be incremental based on the amount that we exceed that on that will reduce the tax, or is there going to be a set 0.02, 0.025 when it exceeds a certain level past the 10 billion?
You mind restating that question just one more time, just so I can make sure I understand it?
So once we exceed that 10 billion and by so many million or whatever it is it going to be preset that we will drop the income tax rate by a certain percentage point, so 0.025 or whatever, or is it just going to be based upon the amount and then it'll be some kind of formulary to figure out the amount.
Yeah, yeah, good question. Mr. Chairman, Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber again. It is determined to allow that $10 billion, what's inflation? So that calculation, 2.1%, would allow the growth of receipts on that baseline budget number. And then anything over inflation, 2.1, 3.0, 1.7, whatever that amount is, determined to be inflation, that gap, the excess growth over inflation, is what would be used to buy down rates to the nearest 0.01%, so nearest hundredth of a percent. That baseline then would reset to that higher number, and then the following year you would go through the calculation again. So you have a higher baseline budget number that you have to meet, plus inflation, plus excess. And if you're not exceeding that, then nothing's changing, if that makes sense.
All right, committee, we'll go ahead and move on to the opponent testimony so we can give them plenty of time. I'd like to first welcome to committee Nathan Kessler.
A little shorter than the previous conferee. All right, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Nathan Kessler. I'm the tax policy advisor with Kansas Action for Children, and today I am here to oppose House Bill 2318. We believe the move from a graduated rate structure to a flat tax would jeopardize the financial health of the state while providing the largest tax cut to high-income individuals and corporations to the detriment of working-class and middle-class Kansans. Rather than setting down a path to achieve a flat corporate and individual income tax rate, the legislature should explore more targeted measures for providing tax relief. Buying down the income tax rate just because tax collections come in higher than expected is a short-sighted approach to budgeting that could ultimately jeopardize the financial health of the state. This would be similar to an individual reducing their hours at work instead of saving just because they covered the bills last month. Economic downturns are inevitable, and this bill could leave Kansas on the back foot during the next one. The greatest strength of a graduated income tax is its durability through a variety of economic conditions. Importantly, this elasticity leaves the system less prone to stress in a recession. Consider the two most recent recessions, 2008 and 2020. During both, working-class occupations in industries such as manufacturing were hit harder than the white-collar workers in other industries. In a graduated rate system, the shock of revenue loss from the lower tax brackets is partially absorbed by the higher rates paid by higher income households. No such shock absorber exists in a single rate system. Without a robust revenue stream, the so-called three-legged stool of taxation, Kansas will be caught in a bind in the next recession and struggle to stage a recovery. Even in good economic conditions, tax base erosion is generally not practical tax policy. A broader base is preferred as it allows for lower rates across the board. Take Missouri, for example, where there are 8 tax brackets and the top marginal rate is just 4.8%. A graduated rate structure allows for higher revenue at lower rates and protects funding for critical public services that Kansans rely on, whereas a flat tax forces the middle class to bear more of the cost for those services. Rather than taking this inefficient route for delivering relief, the committee should consider alternatives like a child tax credit, a sales tax exemption for diapers and feminine hygiene products, or putting renters back into the homestead credit. These targeted efforts will deliver the relief where it is most needed and improve the lives of hundreds of thousands of Kansans, especially children. And I'll take questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you for your testimony. Next, I'd like to welcome Donna Ginther. Welcome to Tax Committee.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. My name is Donna Ginther. I'm a professor of economics, and I direct the Institute for Policy and Social Research at the University of Kansas. And I formerly served on the Governor's Tax Reform Council. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this bill, even though it's an automatic trigger bill. And even though it has no fiscal note as of now, I am giving negative testimony for a number of reasons. It makes the state vulnerable to unanticipated surges in revenue. So, for example, say a corporate entity made a huge estimated tax and pushed us up the receipt level. Then it would trigger an automatic reduction in tax bills. So you're creating permanent tax reductions in response to temporary fluctuations in tax revenues. And it only works in one direction. It does not protect you against an economic downturn. Furthermore, House Bill 2318 will make it difficult for the state to maintain essential services during periods of weak economic performances. So you're quickly triggering a tax reduction in good times and not doing anything in response to bad times. Representative Zhu brought up the question, what about property taxes, right? Property taxes are a leading concern in the state right now because of the increase in property tax valuations. This does not allow you to have any revenue to address concerns about property taxes or sale taxes. By keying the rate reduction or the trigger to the rate of growth of inflation, you're punishing real economic growth. So say the population grows because we've had the Panasonic plant and other investments in manufacturing in the state. So our population will naturally grow along with our revenues. You will have increased demand for state services because of increased population growth. This is very pessimistic. It's assuming that there's no real economic growth. We're just looking at nominal increases and not underlying growth in the real economy. So as soon as our economy grows in real terms, we're going to reduce the amount of money that we're collecting. One of the issues that was brought up by the representatives from the chamber was this makes the state more competitive, right? We are crying for a workforce. We need people to come to the state to work here. And we have to attract them to the state. And their argument is attract them through the tax code. Well, 18 months ago, the Kansas Board of Regents asked me to look at salaries for people with a bachelor's degree in this state. And I'm pulling up my notes from that presentation that I made to the Board of Regents, right? Kansas ranks last in salaries for engineering occupations compared to our border states. In Kansas, the average engineering occupation in 2022 paid $90,000, and in Texas, it paid $109,000 a year. Likewise, in math and computer science, in Kansas, after controlling for different costs of living in the states, you can earn $88,000 as a computer scientist in this state and go to Texas and earn $108,000. I have a list of that in that report. I have a list of all professional positions. The only place where Kansas pays competitive salaries is in the public sector related to teaching. So there's no such thing as a labor shortage. There's just not paying market wages. And if we want to be competitive, I would urge my friends in the Chamber of Commerce to urge their colleagues to pay competitive wages to increase population growth in the United States, in the state of Kansas. Furthermore, we rank 11th as the most affordable state in this country. So I would suggest that wages are making us less competitive than our tax burden. By capping, so overall, my argument is that this bill is contrary to the goals of economic growth and development. By capping revenues at the 2024 level, the bill assumes that there were no unfunded mandates or unfunded obligations in the state. Consider, for example, special education as one example of it not being fully funded. While the intention of the federal government is to cut federal expenditures, the state faces a considerable amount of uncertainty about the future of our economic growth. While the goal is to lower rates and broaden the base, this bill does nothing to broaden the base. Tax collections do not take into account the court-ordered spending if there were a mandate to increase spending on public schools, for example. It does not account for population growth and is in fact pessimistic about the future growth trajectory of the state. And the economic uncertainty that we are facing now as a country is higher than it was during COVID. We have a lot of uncertainty going forward. Our agricultural economy is already in recession. The good news, this trigger won't happen in the next couple of years. But when it does happen, are we going to be prepared to adjust the state for a path of future economic growth? Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next opponent would be Leah Fleiter with the Kansas Association of School Boards. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I think Dr. Ginther is one of the few people who is a shorter conferee than I. I'm usually behind somebody like Dr. Blake Flanders or somebody like that. So I'm here to testify in opposition. There you go. Short women unite. So we oppose this bill essentially because of our legislative policy, which opposes arbitrary limits on revenue, including, of course, income tax rates. We heard a lot from, I think, pretty much all of you that when you were on the campaign trail, when you were knocking doors, what's the refrain we have heard from you all this whole session is that our constituents want property tax relief. We didn't hear anything about income tax relief, especially for high-income individuals or the corporate income tax rate. So we would ask the committee to instead consider a more balanced mix of cuts that spread it across the three-legged stool that we've already talked about. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, that is all that I had showing as appearing before the committee as an opponent. Did I miss anyone? Is there anyone else wishing to appear as an opponent? If not, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Committee, any questions for the opponents? Representative Sanders and then Corbett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is for any of the opponents. Am I understanding that your belief is that if we were to enact this bill, that it would not attract any significant amount of new people to Kansas, nor would it attract business to Kansas? And if so, if that's what you believe, what's your data? Thank you.
Well, I look at the 2017 tax cuts. We had flat population growth. We had a change in the type of companies we had. Many became LLCs. But we didn't have net corporations or companies coming to the state. In fact, I did a report and showed that when we cut taxes under Brownback, we also cut incentives for entrepreneurship. And so our entrepreneurship rates fell relative to the surrounding states because we didn't have the incentives to support new business growth. So I have not seen, so the evidence I've seen on population mobility suggests that senior citizens are very sensitive to income tax rates, and senior citizens move. Well, what did we do last session? We cut the tax on Social Security, so that makes us more attractive to seniors. Seniors are more likely to move because of tax rates, and working people are more likely to move because of jobs, and jobs are tied to the wages. If we produce high-paying jobs in this state, our population will grow. So that makes you think about sort of economic development that supports entrepreneurship and also supports companies coming here like Panasonic, like the CHIPS plan in Burlington, to build more jobs. And that will attract people. And I don't think tax cuts will. They haven't.
Isn't the theory that if there's a lower corporate tax rate, the corporations then theoretically can pay their workers a higher wage?
So we have not seen corporations pass tax cuts through to wages. When they get tax cuts, they usually pass it through to investment.
But if they need workforce?
Well, as I pointed out, competitive wages should increase if we're wanting to attract more people to the state.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Corbett.
This would be for Mr. Stafford.
We're on opponent.
I'll wait.
Okay. Any more questions for the opponents committee? All right, seeing none, do not show any neutral testimony, either written or appearing before the committee. Is there anyone wishing to appear as a neutral testimony? Seeing none, that does conclude our testimony for House Bill 2318, and we will close the hearing on House Bill 2318. Committee, I do want to make you aware, because I usually don't try to rush through things pretty quick, but just due to the nature of the time and where we're at in the session right now, I do want to make everyone aware that we will be hearing House Bill 2396 tomorrow. That's on the calendar. Depending on how that hearing goes, if it looks like there are several amendments that we need to work on, we'll take a look at that, but it is my intention to work that bill on Wednesday. That's 2396. So we'll be working it the day after we hear it. It's a little faster than I usually am comfortable with. I want to give everybody plenty of time to digest that. So I do want to make everybody aware. If you want to start studying that bill, come prepared with any questions you might have tomorrow at the hearing. And we'll work on, if there are significant amendments, I don't want to rush through that. We will try to take our time and make sure we get it done correctly. But I'm just trying to give everyone as much heads up notice as we can on that one. We've also got a hearing on Senate Bill 35, I think, tomorrow as well. But anything else for the good of the committee? Announcement from Representative Helgerson.
First of all, I apologize to the subcommittee on taxation, sales tax, that I've been sick and I wasn't able to continue on in the meetings. But the chairman told me that there's going to be some free time tomorrow after committee. So we'll plan on meeting and talking a little bit about sales tax, the sales tax exemptions, because I understand you passed one while I was gone. Boy, I'm not going to get sick anymore.
While the cat's away, the mice will play.
Right. So we'll plan on meeting, short meeting, talk a little bit among ourselves about what we've learned and if there's other information that we can provide. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Helgerson. With that, committee, we are adjourned.